All right, I see the number kind of being steady, so I'm going to go ahead. So my name is Kim Klein. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Support Services and School Safety. On behalf of Dr. Connolly, our school superintendent, and the Board of Education, we're very excited to have Dr. Doug Bolton with us tonight to present a parent education opportunity. Dr. Bolton has used his degrees in clinical psychology, school psychology, and educational leadership to support students with social, emotional, and behavioral challenges in schools since 1987. Dr. Bolton graduated from Bates College in 1986 with a bachelor's degree in psychology and religion. Subsequently, after working in therapeutic schools and residential facilities for 3 years, he pursued a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Vermont and received his degree in 1995. Dr. Bolton currently consults with schools to enhance their ability to support students with mental health issues. So we are very excited to have Doug in District 21. Some of you may have heard him speak through NSSEO or other areas, venues in our area. So with that, thank you to all of you who have submitted questions when you signed up. At the bottom of your Zoom, you will also see a Q&A section. If you wish to type a question into that box, we will try to get to everything that people submit, but we'll be watching that area as well. So with that, I turn it over to Dr. Bolton.
Thank you, Kim. It's wonderful to be here. And I've had such great opportunities to spend time with all of you and have such respect for the vision and leadership in your district. So thank you. This is my first time with your parent group, and so I'm really happy to be here. You know, it was probably 2 months into our lockdown in COVID, probably April or May, when I started wondering, I wish there was somebody who had been through this or something like it that could help give us a sense of how to make our way through this time. And it's interesting, I thought about my grandmother. My grandmother was born in 1899 and she died about 30 years ago, a little bit more than 30 years ago. But when I started thinking about her life, I realized I wish that I had been able to speak with her. She became kind of, after my parents divorced, she became the person in our lives that was a really important, stable influence. But I never heard her talk about the things that she had been through. When she was just 7, there was a typhoid fever outbreak in her community. And then when she was 15, the US entered World War I, and we lost over 100,000 soldiers. And just 2 years after that, in 1916, when she was 17, there was a polio outbreak. And then we all know what happened in 1918 was the Spanish flu, which took 675,000 American lives and somewhere between 50 and 100 million people worldwide, all before her 20th birthday. But then the Roaring 20s hit, right? And I love this picture of her. She looks like she just is so happy and she'd made it through. And in fact, she met my grandfather, Walt, and they married. And they had my dad, their only child, in February of 1929. But we all know what happened just months later is the stock market crashed. And we were plunged into the Great Depression. And then came World War II, where we lost over 400,000 people, soldiers, American soldiers. And then if kind of consequence had not been hard enough on her, she had her own personal tragedy. My grandfather died suddenly at age of 48 of a heart attack. She became the person in our family that we all relied on a few decades later. She was the person who watched us. She had a real way with kids, didn't she? I love this picture. I asked my brother, I said, send me a picture of Graham and some of us kids. And this is the one he sent. But here's the thing about my grandmother and her generation that went through a pandemic, a depression, and 2 world wars. What do we call that generation? We call them the greatest generation, don't we? Somehow they made it through all of that time. And the 1950s were one of the most prosperous decades in our country's history. And so all of a sudden, out of all of that stress and trauma came the greatest generation. And so I wish I could ask her what made her resilient. And it makes me wonder what can make us resilient. How can we cultivate resilience in our children? And is it possible that we can not just cope during this time, but that we can thrive? So today I want to hit 3 themes. The first is, how do we manage our stress? And one of the really strong themes about tonight is the better we manage our stress, the better we're going to be able to help our kids manage theirs. The second is, how do we take care of our children during this time? And then finally, can we think differently about this time? And I think that we can shift from an understandable focus on all that's taken away to hopefully see opportunity for our kids and for ourselves in this time. COVID-19 is a remarkably novel experience for us. Some aspects of this stress we've never experienced before. One thing is that it's constant. We are always wondering if we're at risk of getting transmission of this disease. We are always at risk of having it transmitted to us, or unwittingly transmitting it to somebody else. There's also the constant economic pressure, isn't there? That there are people losing their jobs, and the constant stress of, are we going to shut down as a country or as a community? There's an intensity to this. So many people are dying. So many people are losing their jobs. And education and all of our work has been turned upside down in a way that we've never experienced before. It's enduring. Did anyone else in March wonder, on I think it was March 13th, when they said we were going to close down everything until April 7th? And I thought, how am I going to make it till April 7th? And here we are, what is it, 9 months later? And then the other thing that's really unique about this is there are very few stresses that impact everybody on the globe. And yet this is a stress that has impacted everybody on the face of our earth. I heard a commentator say that if coronavirus was the earthquake, then our social and racial unrest is the hurricane that came after. This has been an uncertain time in so many ways. And each of us has our own relationship to all of these issues, whether it be COVID, whether it be the racial unrest, or whether it be our election, which has been divisive in ways that I've never experienced before. And you put all these things together, and it really is an extraordinary time with extraordinary stress. But what I also hope that we leave with this is there is extraordinary opportunity, and we'll get to that. All right, part 1, how do we understand and cope with our stress? One of the things that happens is stress pushes us into the lower parts of our brain. That green part of that brain in that picture is our cortex. That's the thinking, rational part of our brain. But what stress does is it pushes us down into our fight, flight, and freeze response, because what ends up happening is it's not that helpful to be a great creative thinker when you're faced with an immediate threat. What we want to do is mobilize all the energy from our brain and other parts of our system into our ability to fight or flee, or sometimes shut down and freeze. So how this works, it's a very primitive system. The autonomic nervous system has 2 branches. One branch is the sympathetic nervous system, which triggers our stress response. That's that fight, flight, or freeze response, right? The other side is our parasympathetic nervous system, which just returns us to homeostasis. It returns us to that place of calm. And the thing is, it's an either-or system. It's really simple. When one is on, the other's off. It's like a train. That train can't be on 2 different tracks at the same time. And so if we are in our stress response, and if we're relaxing, we can't access our stress response unless it gets triggered by fear, right? Which is a real and immediate threat. Our bodies were based on this very, very physical response to physical threats to our safety. Every multi-celled organism has this stress response. So lizards have this. Um, Fruit flies have this, that when faced with a stressor, they will mobilize and then they go back to homeostasis. It's that primitive a system. But the interesting thing that evolution did to us, and it's been wonderful, it puts this amazingly complex prefrontal cortex on top of this really simple two-pronged system for stress. And what it gives us is it creates anxiety. This is where anxiety comes from. So if fear is our response to a real and immediate threat, anxiety is our response to thoughts about potential threats. What does that mean? So here are just a couple of examples. Is it allows us to time travel. It allows us to think ahead and say, oh my goodness, what's going to happen if my children don't get as much academic rigor? And what's going to happen for them in high school and college? Are they losing opportunities? What's going to happen to my parents in a nursing home if they get COVID? What's going to happen if this continues and one of us loses our jobs? All of these things are in the future. And this cortex allows us to think about things that other animals don't think about in the future. The other thing that it allows us to do is go back in time and wonder, why did I go to that party when I knew that that I was going to put myself at risk for COVID, and now someone tested positive and I've got to quarantine? Whatever it may be, we are constantly going back and forth in time in our minds. That's what our cortex allows us to do. And we're also mind readers. We're constantly wondering what other people are thinking and feeling. And we're especially doing that with our kids, right? Are they stressed? Are they doing okay? Are they depressed? Are they worried? What's going to happen to them socially? Are they connected to people? We may wonder about that with our friends. What does our friends think? We're constantly trying to think about what other people are thinking. But here's the thing. We're really bad at both mind reading and at time travel. But our body responds as if these beliefs are true. That's what anxiety does, is it makes us believe that these things are true. And so with all of the different stresses from coronavirus, we are constantly, our sympathetic nervous system is constantly getting triggered. So why would we have anxiety? Why would evolution give that to us? Well, the reason why we have anxiety is it's actually meant to keep us alive and keep us safe. What it does is it tells us, look at all the different things that could go wrong ahead. This is how you make it through this minefield of life. We're going to tell you about all the possible, but it's often wrong. A lot of these things never happen that we're anxious about. It's a little bit like the smoke detector outside of my kitchen. Does anybody else have a poorly placed smoke detector where every time I'm cooking toast, the thing goes off? Or on the other side of the room where my grill is outside, every time I grill, the thing goes off? My smoke detector has gone off probably 100 times and we've never had a fire. But that's when it's working, right? It's not supposed to be right only when there's a fire. It's supposed to alert us at any possible thing that could be dangerous to us so that we can protect ourselves. And that's what anxiety does. Anxiety is constantly going off, even if the threats are not imminent or real. It's not that these thoughts are rational. All these thoughts are rational, but they're also not true. But our body responds as if they are. And so our autonomic nervous system is constantly during this time kicking into our sympathetic nervous system and triggering our stress response. The way it's supposed to work is a grizzly, we run into a grizzly bear and we're fast enough to outrun it. And so our stress response, our fight, flight, freeze response gets triggered and we get to safety and then it all comes back down. Someone cuts us off in traffic and we act very quickly and then we're safe and it comes back down. The problem with this kind of stress that's so omnipresent, it's always there for us, is that our stress response is constantly getting triggered. And when we go into lower brain, when we go into fight, flight, and freeze, we are not as good at listening or being creative or being flexible or having empathy. I'm not sure if you've noticed, but a lot of people say their memory is struggling more. They lose their ability to, language is harder. It's harder to write. It's harder to find words for things. And inhibition, we are much more impulsive. This is what happens when we're under stress. Our brains look a little bit like this, right? And so what you may find is that you don't feel like you're the same parent, or you can't show up as friends or spouses or colleagues in the way that you typically do. And a lot of people have said that their energy, they just don't have as much energy or focus or motivation or optimism the way they typically do. This is all very natural, especially when stress has gone on as long as it has. So what we need to do, since everything in our world is pushing us towards our stress response, we need to manually override this very primitive system. And so here's some of the ways we do that. We want to move into homeostasis. So just a couple of ideas. Exercise, diet, and sleep. These are like the top three. If we can do these things, we can, it helps us return to homeostasis so much better. Exercise is an interesting one because what exercise does, we have this, when we go into fight, flight, and freeze response, our body is geared towards action. What exercise does is it lets us express that. Now, it doesn't mean that you need to train for a marathon, right? This is not, it doesn't need to be that time, but it does mean that being able to get movement in a time when we're sitting in front of screens is so important. And I would also say, no matter how cold it is in this winter, getting outside is also really important. It might be a 15-minute walk or a 10-minute walk. It might be finding a workout routine on the internet and doing that several times a week, but making sure we are keeping our physical body active and the things we bring into our house are as healthy as possible, because diet will sap a lot of our resilience, and sleep is really important. One of the things, I'm not sure if other people have found, but I've found sleep to be much more sporadic for me. There are days that I sleep well, and then days when I'm really sleeping worse than I ever have before. And the important thing about sleep is, even if you're having a hard time sleeping, making sure that you've got good sleep routines. Because if we get out of the routine, it's going to be much harder for us to be able to capture sleep during the pandemic and after. Hobbies are really helpful, or ways that you regulate. If you like to read books or take walks, if you love an outdoor garden, maybe you can create an indoor herb garden. Scrapbooking, crosswords, whatever it is, what hobbies do is they take us out of that, all of that worry, and focus us on something that we can feel productive and good about. Routines are really helpful. One of the hardest things about this time, and one of the hardest things about stress in general, is when it's unpredictable and we don't know when this is going to end. There's so much that's unpredictable for us. But one of the ways that we can go back and feel comforted is when we know what's going to happen in the next 10 minutes, the next hour, what's going to happen this afternoon. When we can get into routines and we can help our kids get into routines, it's so important. And what I would say also is that I think that we're missing the transitions to work and school and back home. If we can begin to create routines where maybe you get dressed for remote learning and remote work, maybe you take a walk before school and your work begins, and you take a walk afterwards, to be able to put some boundaries in between what's happening with your schoolwork or work at home, for your kids, their schoolwork, and your work, and what's happening in the family. Connection is really, really hard at this time, and I think it's going to get harder. We had a nice summer for the most part, being able to socially distance outdoors, and it's getting darker and colder. We need to be intentional. Those things are going to drop off, but can we pick up some other ways of being in touch with people? It's so important that we maintain these connections. There are a lot of really good mindfulness and breathing apps. And I would say we could talk for a long time about these, but the wonderful thing about mindfulness is the goal of mindfulness is to focus us on this present moment. And what that does is it quiets our mind reader, and it quiets our time traveler and lets us just be in this moment. And the interesting thing about breathing is, have you ever noticed that when you're under stress, you breathe shallower and you hold the breath more? We've got nerves that from our autonomic nervous system that are attached to our lungs. And the thing that, it's paying attention to how we breathe. And what happens when we get through something really, really difficult and we can finally relax? We exhale, right? And that what that exhaling does is it triggers the rest of our autonomic nervous system to say, oh, things must be safe because you're exhaling. And so the more we can breathe, and there are some great breathing apps, the more we can breathe, and especially the more we can exhale longer than we inhale, that helps trigger and trigger our homeostasis. It helps us relax. I love the research on gratitude. It's so simple to do, and it can be so powerful, especially in times when it feels like the world is against all of us. What gratitude does, it's a very simple, the research is very clear and robust. My favorite study is the one where they had people writing right before they went to bed, writing in a gratitude journal, 3 things they were grateful for that day. And these are not things, these aren't like, oh, I'm grateful that I've got a roof over my head and I'm grateful that I've got a loving family. We can be grateful for those things, but this exercise was really about being grateful for certain things that happened that day. I'm really grateful that my husband or wife brought me coffee when they could tell that I was really stressed in my Zoom meeting at work. I'm so grateful that I got a note from my child's teacher helping me understand, and so I could better help my kid. I'm so grateful that I heard my kids giggling downstairs, whatever it may be, these moments of gratitude. They had them do it just for a week, so only 21 items of gratitude. And then they left them alone for 6 months. And they came back and measured them, how anxious and depressed they were. What they found is the people who just did that for a week, 6 months later, showed reduced anxiety and depression compared to those who didn't do gratitude journals. Can we add gratitude as a practice in our lives? Maybe it's around the dinner table with our family, but really being grateful for these moments. So, would you take a pill that creates a misperception of risk, that increases anxiety and learned helplessness and feelings of contempt and hostility and decreases your mood? Who would take that, especially now, right? We do this all the time. This is what happens. This is the natural physical response and emotional response to watching the news. I'm a big fan of Lester Holtz, but this is what happens when we watch the news. Here's the thing. When I discovered this word, I'm like, this word describes me perfectly. Doom scrolling. It's the act of continuously seeking out and reading bad news. I'm the kind of person that I'll sit there and I'll say, oh, I've got 5 minutes. I'm just going to check my social media feed. And I am drawn like a moth towards light, towards the most disturbing stories that I can find. And then I'm there for 20 minutes. I'm like, find myself, and you may not notice it, but your breathing changes and your heart rate changes. There's all these body changes are happening. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't be informed, because this is a time when we really need to be informed more than ever. But like a museum curator that figures out what art do we bring in, we've got to curate this. We've got to figure out, what information do I bring into my life? And it may mean that we spend less time on social media. It may mean that we only follow certain sites or certain platforms, but we need to be really careful, because that in its own quiet way can impact our level of stress. And then finally is this idea of impermanence. And this is the one that really hit home for me. When coronavirus first hit, I found myself more down than I've ever found myself in my professional life. And it was really very, very hard. And as I started trying to understand, how do we cope with this time? one of the themes that continued to come up was this idea of impermanence. And that is that all of our experiences and all of our moods, it's never stable. It's always going up and going down. And so I'm not sure that since that time, there have been times like I feel like I've got this, right? I'm on top of this wave. I'm doing good. And then it's only a matter of time, maybe a couple hours, maybe a couple days, maybe it lasts a week before I'm upside down and feeling like, oh my gosh, the world is just crushing me. But then I've never felt down in my life without at some point feeling like I'm going to be okay again. And there's never been a time when I felt really good about life that it didn't follow at some point that I felt really down again. These are just the cycles of life. We're in a big cycle right now. Don't get me wrong. But we're constantly in the state of up and down. So what we can do for ourselves and for our kids is to know if we're feeling down, it's going to take a while, but if we're patient, we know that we're going to be back up again. And when we're on top, just know that there's going to be a time coming soon, sooner probably rather than later in this time, when we're going to feel down again. And it's not just in our personal lives, is it? It's historical as well. A polio epidemic and a Spanish flu and a world war led to the Roaring 20s, and then depression and World War II, and then the Greatest Generation. We're constantly riding these waves as a society as well. And so can we surf these waves gracefully? And when things are going well and then get hard, not feel like the world has somehow betrayed us. And when we're down, not feel like it's always going to last, that we know we're going to come out of it again. So our work is to be intentional. I'm not saying we have to do all these things. I'm sure you guys are doing some of these already. But the goal is, especially as we go into winter, is that we've got to figure out which of these, what can we add to give ourselves that much more resilience, to help us feel that much more calm, to help us continue to return to homeostasis. Which practices work best for us? Which ones can we implement? We need to be more intentional than ever. All right, how do we take care of our children? Take a quick drink of water. So here's the thing. We talked about being in lower brain. During this time, our kids are going to be limited in what they're going to be able to learn and how they just are, right? And we're limited, and our teachers are limited. Everybody is limited because of this stress. We talked about going into lower brain and not being able to listen or be as creative or as flexible or as empathetic. That's just how it's just the way our brains work. And so we need to understand that. So given that, how will they cope and how will we cope? But I guess I also want to share, there's real opportunity here. And the opportunity is to cultivate resilience. One of the things that's happened in the last several generations is we have seen a rise in mental health problems in kids because they've not been able to be resilient to the stresses in their lives. And right now, as the world is facing similar, very intense stresses, this is our opportunity to teach them resilience. Resilience cannot be cultivated without stress. And so we need to use this opportunity we've got this opportunity more than ever in several generations to really teach and coach resilience in our kids. So how do we do that? Well, the first piece that I would say, I love D.W. Winnicott. He was a psychoanalyst. He was a physician a pediatrician back in the 1940s, way back then. And he had this theory. At the time, there were these theories of parenting that said, you need to do it exactly this way and your child will be successful. But if you don't parent in the exact right way, your kid is likely not to be successful. And what D.W. Winnicott, and this is 1940, so he talked about mother, he talked about the good enough mother, and I would say the good enough mother, the good enough father, the good enough teacher, the good enough uncle, the good enough coach, whatever. We just need to be good enough. And here's what he says. He said, babies and children actually benefit when their mothers fail them in manageable ways. What ends up happening is when we fail them, then they need to cope with the stress of our failure. So if we forget to pick our child up at baseball practice, And they realize the world is not as predictable as they thought it would be, and they've got to figure out how they're going to get away home. Maybe this is what I was thinking when I was a kid and we didn't have cell phones. But there are, how do we, when there are challenges, when we don't show up for them in the way we typically do, they need to be able to cope with that. This is a small thing, but this gave me some comfort. My daughter had studied for months for the SAT, and she had her SAT morning prior to the SAT down to the minute. And she said, "Dad, can I borrow the car? Can you just make sure the car is back by 7:30? And sure enough, I pulled the car in at 7:28. I did my job. She gets in the car and she heads off. And then 5 minutes later, she's in the house and she said, "Dad, you left no gas in the car." I had failed her. It threw off her entire morning. She had to go and stop and get gas, and then she was stressed about that. And she realized that she was going to be okay. And it worked out okay. And even though I failed her, and even though I felt terrible about causing stress to her day that was so important, that she had planned so much, she also learned a lesson that when unexpected things happen, it can be okay. But the problem for us as parents, and I think our generation of parents, is the biggest inner critic. It's really hard to see our kid in distress. And when we do, we blame ourselves for our kid's distress. I'm an idiot. Why are things, why are parents so much better than I am? I should have done a better job with this. We don't need to be perfect. We just need to survive this storm. We're going to be hit with these waves. We are getting hit with these waves. We are not going to look pretty when this is all over. We are going to be wet and soaked and wrinkled. We're not every hair in place, but at the end of this, if we are holding each other's hands and holding the hands of our neighbors and holding the hands of the teachers that are working so hard to teach our kids, when we can be at the end of this, survive this together, that's the goal. Brene Brown said, sometimes the bravest and most important thing you can do is just show up. And Dan Siegel, who I think is the preeminent voice in child development these days, he and Tina Bryson wrote the book, The Power of Just Showing Up. And what they talk about is it's not about being perfect, it's about being present for our kids. And here's what they say. Showing up is about helping kids feel safe and seen and soothed and secure. And that all starts with us. Those psychologists are so smart, aren't they, to make it easy for us to remember. And when we talk about being safe, we're talking about protecting kids from harm, and we are bending over backwards to protect them from harm. I like this picture because at some level, we can't be in enough danger that we're running away, but my mom has her arm around me. This is me and my mom and my sister. And it's a metaphor for feeling psychologically safe, that even though something's out there, I feel secure with her. We're talking about psychological safety here, is helping kids feel like that they're safe from psychological risk. Probably the best way we do that is to help them, is to avoid becoming the source of fear ourselves. And I'm not sure if you guys have made this mistake, but I've made this mistake a lot more recently. And that is, I've lost it with my kids more than I want to admit. It's been a really hard time for me. And there are times when I lose my temper and I say things and I treat them in ways that I really regret. I need to keep reminding myself that it's okay. But what I want to do when I notice that that's happening a lot is to make sure that I'm taking care of myself, so I'm less likely to do that. But the other thing is, it gives us the opportunity, if we can forgive ourselves and then make it right with our kids, what that does is it shows them when they lose their temper and when they lose their cool, they learn from us how to make it right. That is the opportunity. We're going to lose it. We're going to lose our temper and lose our cool at different points in time throughout our lives, and so are they. Let's make sure they're learning how to make it right by watching us make it right with them. The second one is helping kids feel seen. And this is being attuned to their feelings and being curious. Their life in coronavirus is very different than our lives. And so being curious to see life through their eyes. I think this is really interesting. I'm not sure if you guys remember, maybe some of you have infants, but we are hardwired to mimic the faces of our infant. And what's happening in that is the baby feels something and makes a face. And when we mimic that face, they can see what they're feeling reflected in our face. It's the basis of how they begin to understand their own emotional lives. And it's happening all the time, right? All the time. Some people take it a little too far. This isn't all that helpful. But as kids get older, it looks like this, right? Just being present, seeing what it is they're feeling. And then helping them realize that whatever their feelings are, they're both real and fleeting, just like ours. And especially younger kids are constantly experiencing, they can be in a terrible mood at 10 o'clock and by 10:15, laughing and joking. These feelings are often fleeting, but they're also very real for them. And we need to honor that. But the mistakes we make is we try and fix this for them. We see them in distress. It's distressing for us, or we rush in and we try and fix it, but that keeps them from learning how to fix it themselves. Or we minimize it. And we say, why are you worried about that? That's ridiculous. You shouldn't worry about that. And these kinds of things, both of them can be shaming. And oftentimes when kids are in distress, there's also a sense of shame that can happen, or we lose our cool with them, and that feels shaming. So what can we do? Our work then is to soothe them, and soothing is about returning them to homeostasis, helping them calm down, not fixing the problem, because there's so many problems we can't fix. But the bottom line is we can help them learn to calm themselves down. But the first step is you need to soothe yourself first. There's no way we can soothe our kids if we're not soothed first. I like this quote: when little people are overwhelmed by big emotions, it's our job to share our calm, not join their chaos. And this is kind of a new agey term, but I really like it. And the term is holding space. And I like this picture. You can see the child is in distress, and the parent is just being present. They're not fixing it, but they're just sitting with them in their distress, helping them learn how to cope with it, how to ride this wave. And ideally, we help kids learn how to cope themselves. With younger kids, it might be a teddy bear. And with older kids, it might be music or shooting baskets or whatever it may be. But the mistakes we make is that we punish instead of soothe. When our kids are dysregulated, either we try and fix it and take it away, or we punish them. And I like this picture. This boy is clearly on a timeout, right? But look at the posture of how much shame they're experiencing. Their face, their head is tilted down and they're facing the wall. But they've got their arm around Charlie. And what I guess I want to say is, instead of take a time out, you've been a bad kid, to be able to say, this is really upsetting and I'm not helping. Why don't you and Charlie go downstairs, and when you're ready, let's come back upstairs and we'll figure it out together. Time is amazing. Timeouts work because kids get time, not because we're punishing them, not because we're taking them away from things, but because eventually the time kicks in. Can we do that without giving them a shaming message? And the other piece about this is it's not just time in the moment. These skills are skills that they will continue to develop until they're about 25. So they're going to get better at this when they're 18 than when they're 8, right? And they're going to be even better when they're 28. We need to give these skills some time. And then finally, if we have kids, help them feel safe and seen and soothed, then they've got a secure base with which to approach the world. I like this. This came from one of the middle schools in the district. In the bathroom, I was giving an opening day talk a couple years ago, and I walked in, and here this was on the wall, and I thought, this is the perfect definition of resilience that kids are seeing every day. You have within you right now everything you need to deal with whatever the world can throw at you. And that's what being secure is. And the world is throwing everything at us and our kids, isn't it? Throwing everything, and we are adapting. We're finding our way through this. But in order to help our kids experience these things, we need to take care of ourselves. And I know that I'm beating a dead horse, but this is how we do it. And for us to realize that good enough is good enough. And let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, that there's beauty in imperfection. When we struggle, then we learn. If we can forgive ourselves and apologize. Kids are watching how we're coping with this. I love this quote by James Baldwin. Children have never been very good at listening to their elders, but they have never failed to imitate them. Our kids are watching, and they're seeing how their teachers and how their parents have responded, and they're learning how to cope with stress in ways no generation in the last 50 years has been able to see. More than 50 years, actually, 60, 70 years. I like this quote by Nenea Hoffman. All you have to do is show up, be late, be scared, be a mess, be weird, be confused, just be there. You'll figure out the rest as you go. And then finally, can we think differently about this time? Can we think differently about resilience? Tom Boyce did some really interesting research that I really like. He tested saliva samples to understand kids' stresses, and then he followed these kids from kindergarten all the way through high school, and he was able to see what impacts kids' resilience. And what he found is what he said, there are some kids who are dandelions and some kids who are orchids. And he said the dandelions are amazing because they can grow up just about anywhere. They can grow up between a crack of concrete. No matter what the world is throwing at them, they seem to be able to manage it okay. The orchids are equally amazing because if we get their soil just right and the light and the water just right, they will thrive and become absolutely beautiful. And so what he said is 80% of the kids in his study are dandelions. And I think that that's what we're finding in our schools and in our families is about 80% of the kids are doing okay. I'm not saying they're doing great, and I'm not saying they're happy. I'm saying they are surviving this very, very challenging time. Resilience, he found, is the norm. It's not the exception. But he said 20% of kids are orchids. These are the kids we need to get the soil just right for them to be able to thrive. But when they thrive, they're going to be even more beautiful. So we don't have to worry necessarily about all kids during this time, but we do need to focus and put our energy into the orchids as best we can. And one of the ways we do this is when kids are struggling, and a lot of the questions on some of the questions that were submitted early asked, what do we do to help our kids if they're struggling to engage? I'll tell you what, the most important thing we can do, I think, is to be curious and really ask with as open a mind as possible about why this is so hard for them. Why is it hard to get online? What's the hardest part? What parts of the day are hardest? Are there classes that are hardest? One of the things that we do as parents is we just assume, oh, they're just lazy, they're trying to get out of it. Oh, they're not resilient enough to be able to handle it, or whatever it may be. And so we don't ask the question. If I could do one thing, if I could go back in my parenting, my kids are both just about out of high school. I've got a senior and a sophomore in college. I just wish I had been more curious as a parent and didn't assume about what was happening for them. A lot of the other questions are about connections. What do we do when our kids don't have the same social connection? But I guess I want us to think differently about the opportunity that we have in our homes. I know that social skills are really important with their peers, but one of the things that happens as kids spend more and more time with their peers, they spend less and less time with us, and they're less exposed to us as models. They're less exposed to our values. They're less exposed to us as being a part of their relationship. And I guess what I want to say right now is let's take full advantage of that opportunity. Let's make sure we're doing games nights, or we're walking with them. Or if they won't get out of the basement and off the video game, let's learn how to play their video game with them. Whatever it may be, let's figure this out, because this is going to be precious time, and this is precious time. And I wouldn't be surprised if at the end of all this, one of the things we said was, that was the hardest time of our lives, but we spent more time as a family, and that was important to all of us. That's what we found. We never had family dinners together. I've got a private practice. I'm at work at night, right? And yet for 4 months straight, we had family dinners. And all of a sudden, now I've got a choice. I'm not at family dinner tonight, but I'm at family dinners a lot more, because of this time is so important. And during this time, one of the things that's so important is, let's tell our story about what this pandemic means to me in my life. And let's hear theirs. Humans think in stories. We try and make sense of the world by telling stories. So let's make sense of this together. It's so hard to make sense of, but as we tell our stories and as we listen to their story, can we try and make sense of this as best we can as a family and create our own narrative? Can we think differently about achievement? One of the things that we really worry about is, oh my goodness, my child is missing instruction, right? Or the instruction isn't as rigorous. What's going to happen? What I want us to do is say, while we don't have the same opportunity for them to achieve academically in the same way, and I want to tell you, I am absolutely positive that they're going to be fine with their achievement. They're going to learn by the time they are 25. They will have learned all that they need to learn, or all that they're going to learn. But this is an opportunity like no other to teach resilience. I had a conversation with a superintendent, and I said to her, I think in World War II, when they were bombing London, they closed schools for about 2 years, maybe a year and a half, but a good year and a half to 2 years. And nobody says, wow, that was a dumb generation. Wow, that generation underachieved. In fact, that generation also became the greatest generation, right? So I was interested when she said, my father grew up in World War II in London. And he and his mom was a teacher. And they moved out to the country, and they tried to teach lessons in barns, and it just didn't work. So he didn't have instruction for a good 2 years. And I said, well, what happened to him? And she said, well, he ended up coming to America, and he got his PhD. And I would add, and his daughter's a superintendent. Things worked out okay, and they completely missed 2 years of instruction. Kids' brains are not stopping learning. They may be learning different things, but their brains are constantly learning and engaged, and they will continue to learn. And I believe that the world will be generous when grading them against typical learning standards. But I also believe that one of the things they're learning is how to be resilient, and that will help them navigate academics in their future. And when things get hard academically, because they've managed this time and learned how to be resilient with this stress, they will handle academic stress better in the future. Finally, can we think differently about stress? We hear a lot about post-traumatic stress, but I guess I want to talk about post-traumatic growth. People who experience adversity often see positive growth afterwards and rise to a higher level of functioning than they had even before the adversity showed up. A traumatic event, it turns out, is not simply a hardship to be overcome. Instead, it is transformative. It becomes a dividing line in people's lives. People can grow and develop. Some of the ways that research says that people grow as a result of stress and manageable trauma is that they have increased inner strength. They have an openness to new possibilities in life. They have closer and offer deeper relationships with friends and families. They have an enhanced appreciation for life and a stronger sense of spirituality. And here's the thing, we hear a lot about post-traumatic stress, but post-traumatic growth is actually more common than post-traumatic stress. How can we help our kids experience post-traumatic growth? Resilience is learned. I like this quote from Eileen Zimmerman. You can think of resilience as a set of skills that can be learned. Part of the skill building comes from exposure to very difficult but manageable experiences. Please notice the wording, difficult but manageable experiences. Isn't that the same learning that Winnicott talked about 80 years ago? Manageable, kids can actually benefit when we fail them in manageable ways. That kids are learning as a result of these difficult times. They're learning how to cope. They're learning how to be resilient. All right, I'm going to finish with what I think about the flip side of coronavirus. Coronavirus has come in and it's taken away so many things. It's turned our world upside down and left us in pieces in many, many ways. And I know this is corny, but I believe it. Opportunity often comes disguised in the form of misfortune or temporary defeat. And there hasn't been a time in my life when I've experienced more misfortune or more temporary defeats. But I also want to say that this is a time that our kids are experiencing stress, and we cannot helicopter our kids out of this stress, and we cannot snowplow it out of their way. They are experiencing it, and as they are experiencing it, they are learning, and the only way you can learn how to be resilient, they are learning resilience. We can rebuild after this time, but we've got to be careful about what are we learning and what have we learned. When this is all over, we need to ask ourselves, what have we learned? What I learned is family dinners are important. The question is, what do we keep? Yes, I'm going to keep family dinners. They are important. Are we going to keep the three or four travel teams and the 6 AP classes in high school and this and that and all the different things? One of the things that happened when the world shut down is our lives got quieter. One of the things we found is that kids are sleeping longer. There's good things that are happening as a result of this. What do we keep? And what do we let go of? It's important that we're intentional about that now. Because if we're not, we're just going to fall back into all of the things that created the stresses that led to the mental health epidemic. And we're going to continue to try and protect our kids from manageable stresses. And what we want to do is have all of our kids recognize that they have within them whatever they need to handle whatever the world can throw at them. We are asking our children to be more independent than ever before. We're asking them to be more resilient, and we're asking them to be part of a community that's working together to solve this problem, this crisis, this pandemic. And what we're going to find, I truly believe that what we're going to find is that this generation of kids, as hard as this is, going to be more independent, more resilient, and more community focused. Things that they've been missing for 2 generations. 10 years from now, I don't think our kids are going to say, geez, I didn't learn punctuation because my grammar unit during remote learning was not strong, so I didn't get into the Masters of Fine Arts program in Michigan. I don't think they're going to say that. What they're going to say is, the world turned us our whole lives upside down in 2020. And we all adapted. Our teachers all of a sudden started teaching us on computers. And my parents started working from home. And we started doing things as a family in a way we never had before. And it was hard. And yet we made it through. 2 world wars, a pandemic, a depression led to the greatest generation. And I believe that this pandemic is going to cultivate resilience in our kids in a way that we have been needing them to cultivate resilience for generations. Ernest Hemingway said, "The world breaks everyone, and afterward many are strong at the broken places." Our kids are going to be stronger, and we're going to be stronger as a result of this. March came in and coronavirus came and changed everything in our lives, and it still got its grip on us. But we get to write the next chapter. And I'm really excited to see what we write as a community. I'm going to take some questions now, but I also want to share that if there's any way that me or any of my colleagues can be helpful to you, we're going to have parenting groups starting in the new year to help parents if you want to get some support in figuring out how to navigate this. Please shoot me an email and we'll get you set up for one of those groups. I'm really hopeful that we can get through this time as hard as it is and that we're going to be stronger because of it. All right, I will stop sharing my screen. And Kim, I think you've got some questions.
I do. So in the idea of, one of the parents asked, what are some of the things that they might need to let go of during this time? Right, thinking about good enough is good enough, right?
Yeah.
So thinking about time with technology, feeling like they need to monitor everything on Google Classrooms. What would you suggest is okay to let go of right now?
Yeah, I think that every family is going to have different things that they feel stress about and causes stress between them. I would say that really trying to figure out what are the things that are most stressful for you and your child, and really trying to let go of those, as long as those things that you're letting go of are not things that enhance resilience. So if I would still try and get my kids outside every day, for instance, but it may be that if your child feels like you're constantly over their shoulder in Google Classroom, you give them more independence and see how they do, right? And if things get harder, then maybe you'd have a conversation and say, when I'm not monitoring it, things got harder. Let's figure out how we can work this out together, whatever that may be. But I would figure out what are the stressful parts, what are the things that are most stressful for you. If getting into fights over technology, over kids' phones is really, really hard right now, I would figure out, is this something I can let go of? Is the stress from our arguments worse than the stress of being on the phone? These are some of the balances that I think we need to make all the time, but in particular during this time.
So thinking about leading into this, we talked a lot, right, about kids in front of the screens and trying to reduce that. And now it feels like everything they're doing is in front of a screen. So one of the parents talked about, how learning in the spring, right, a lot of it was asynchronous. And now in the fall, there's a lot more synchronous teaching going on. And it feels like kids are going from one class to the other on the screen. Yeah. And they're worried about what this could be doing to brain development. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that, different kids have different tolerances for being able to sit and look at a screen. My daughter, she could sit and look at the screen all day and be okay. And my son really struggles with that. He really disliked remote learning. What I would say is that that there are kids who may need more breaks. And, I think that schools are in a tricky spot trying to hit learning targets and everything else, while also knowing that kids need breaks. And so what I would do is if you've got a child who you think needs more breaks, I would contact the teacher and just say, how can we work in a couple of breaks, or are there ways that I'm going to have my son step outside for these times? What would be a good time in class to be able to do that? Whatever it may be. But I don't disagree that we've got to help kids learn how to take breaks, and that those breaks will restore the parts of, restore their focus. And it doesn't have to be a long break. What I would say is the key to taking breaks, though, there are a couple of them, is it doesn't need to be long, but you do need to get away from everything, getting away from technology. So a break is not moving from your Zoom class to your Snapchat, right? Getting outside is really important for a break. If it can be social, if you can work your break as a parent, if you're home with your child's break, being able to take a walk in the backyard and then come back to class, whatever that may be. But I think that every child is going to have to work this out. And I can let Kim maybe talk about, and I don't mean to put anybody on the spot from the district, but I think that this is something that schools and parents are going to have to figure out, which is how can we give kids enough time, academic time, to help them get the learning done they need. And there's also a need to take breaks so that they can be more available to that learning. And finding that balance is something I think every school is trying to figure out, along with parent communities.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, right? I think everyone coming into this fall did not want remote learning to feel like it did in the spring, right? Because as we were shifting what our instruction looks like and what we know in terms of how to do remote teaching, that has drastically changed over the summer. And so as a district, we are constantly having those conversations about finding that just right balance and making sure that that kids have a good mix of the breaks built into their synchronous learning, and that they are still having those times where they can learn independently as well. So Doug, another one of sort of a theme of questions is ownership in learning, right? So how, I heard you talk about if your kids are interested in video games, like learn their video game. And I think about my nephew. But what about how do they then encourage their children to get online and attend school online when they really are trying everything that they know, and how to keep kids motivated in learning from home?
Yeah, this is really a tricky one, and I think it's interesting. I think what we may be finding is that there are some of these kids are our orchid kids. And it's interesting because every school that I've gone to, teachers have said there are some kids who are actually doing significantly better and are more engaged with online learning. Something about not having the social stresses and all the transitions of school means that they're thriving online in ways that they hadn't before. And there are other kids who do really well in school who are struggling more. There's a couple of things that I think, there's no one easy answer to any of these things, but this is where I would start. The first is, again, I would start by being curious. The first thing I would say is, what are your goals for this school year? I think oftentimes what we'll do as parents is to say, you need to get this work done or else you're going to fail. And if you fail, then this happens, which just puts them more and more into lower brain. What I would do is I would say, help me understand what your goals are. I know it's really hard to be in remote learning, but what are your goals for this, for your schoolwork for this year? Do you have a goal for grades? And oftentimes they will have a goal and they're struggling to meet their own goal. And so we don't have to, and their goals are often similar to what our goals are, but they're struggling with that. And then saying, what do you think is keeping you from getting there? What's the hardest thing about remote learning for you? What's the hardest part about it? And hopefully if we can really listen without the threat, right? Like oftentimes we'll have a threat associated with it, is if you don't do this, then you're going to fail and then you're going to do this. Or we say, if you do this, we're going to give you this incentive. But really what we're wanting to do is understand, why is this so hard? And how can we coach you? How can we be partners in helping you solve this really hard problem? Their kids don't want to fail. They want to do well in school. And so figuring out why is it they're struggling. And so I know that that's a bit of a simplistic answer, but I would be curious about what their goals are. I would be curious about what's keeping them from reaching those goals. And then I would offer to be a partner in helping figure it out, rather than coming in and saying, well, this is what you need to do. Because if it was easy for them to do, they'd be doing it. I don't believe that kids are not online because they're being lazy. I believe there are other barriers to it. And I guess we just need to be thoughtful and curious about what those barriers are, and then help figure out how can we make it through. I guess the other piece is, I think, and this is just my own belief, I think the world's going to be very forgiving about this time. I think if they miss a certain amount of instruction, we're going to find ways to boost them up so that they're going to make it through this time. I've got a big belief about that that we're going to make it through this time, just like the World War II kids made it through that time. Some were in different parts of England were able to be in school for 2 years, and there were kids in London who weren't. And those kids in London, at the end of the day, were able to catch up in life in ways that they wouldn't have predicted otherwise. And I think the same thing is going to happen with this.
So moving into the idea of anxiety and being able to help children express their emotions.
Yeah.
One of the questions is, at times, my 10-year-old worries about failing when not completing an assignment. And in the moment, how can we help when the anxiety is so high he cannot stop to listen?
Yeah. I think that's where I think the holding space piece, you know, when we're in that lower brain place, as children are when they get to the place of the child in this question, they're not able to listen to us. In the same way, when I'm really upset, I'm not able to listen to people very well. And so I think it's just our being able to tolerate and sit with them through that stress until they begin to calm down. Help them figure out what are the things that are helpful to calm down, and then as they start to calm down and then can talk about it, to say, okay, you failed. I'm not sure I can't remember if they failed a test or they failed something.
Worried about failing.
Worried about failing, and then being able to say, well, let's talk about what your worries are, and let's figure out if we can keep those things from happening. How can I help you? What are you worried might happen?
Right, and that leads into the next question about how to help kids really feel their emotions and how to express them. Right, it's one thing to say, tell me how you're feeling, but how do parents help their children feel safe in doing that?
Yeah, I think that these are great questions, by the way. What I would say is that we've got to be able to tolerate when they express feelings to us. And so when they say, I'm worried I'm going to fail, and we say to them, oh, no, you're not going to fail. You're so smart. You won't fail. You've never failed before. All of a sudden, we're shutting them down, right? And what we want to do is just sit with them as they say that they're worried about that they're going to fail. And we just listen and we reflect back. It's about being attuned, right? It's about helping them feel seen. And so being able to, the less we react and the more curious we are, as opposed to trying to take away the feelings or trying to fix them, that's when kids begin to find their vocabulary. Some kids have different feeling vocabulary. Some kids are able to talk about feelings really well. Same with adults. I work with a number of adults who really struggle to express their feelings well. But the key thing is, can we be regulated? Can we be emotionally calm so that when they share their feelings, they don't have to worry about what our reaction is going to be? And then they will find the words, or we can say, it sounds like you're feeling really discouraged, or it sounds like you're feeling anxious that you're going to fail, or you feel you got a bad grade on a test, and you're feeling discouraged about your work. We can begin to give them those feelings, as long as we say, don't feel, oftentimes we'll say, don't feel that. And I think that that's what we've got to be careful of.
We also had some parents ask, how do you know if your child is stressed? What would you tell parents to look for? And then another question was, how would you know if your child has depression?
Yeah, I think that here's what I would say, that there's a lot of different symptoms, I suppose, of stress, but it looks different in everybody. Everybody looks different when they're stressed. And so I guess the first thing I would do is to be really attuned to yourself. You know your kid better than anybody. And what I would say is that if you start to worry that they're stressed, then I would ask them how they're feeling. I would spend more time with them. In the same way, though, if there's issues related to sleep, if there are issues related to shortness of temper, difficulty concentrating, all of the things that we talked about for us in the beginning of this is true for them as well. And also, I also want to say that it's really important, the same coping strategies can be really helpful. Doing gratitude with them every night as part of your bedtime routine with them, if you have a bedtime routine, having meals together, getting outside with them, instead of having them walk the dog with them, spending time with them. The best way that we can help our child feel more regulated and less stressed. We are social beings, and the more time we can spend with our calm self, we have to be calm with them. But when we can be calm and spending time with them, that's throughout the week, that's better than any 50-minute therapy hour I could ever give them. And so the important thing, I'm hoping I'm answering this question okay, is being able to notice the signs of stress as it relates to irritability, as it relates to changes in sleep or diet or any of those things. And then let's spend time with them as best we can. And if you have worries, if you feel like this is over the top, there are a lot of places that can support you in getting some help. And our practice is one, but there are a lot of places out there that can help you do an assessment and just rule out whether or not the stress is something that needs additional support.
And I would also echo being able to reach out to your child's principal or the school social worker or psychologist is also an avenue that you could pursue to be able to start, to talk about the changes maybe that Doug was talking about.
I actually was going to say that, but I didn't want to get into it. But here's the thing. The nice thing about the school is not just you will be noticing these things, but the teachers will notice. And there's great resources at school to be able to start to ask these questions. And so thank you, Kim. I figured that that your district would be really open to supporting any worries that people would have, but I didn't want to offer that for you.
Yeah, you talked about regulation. What do you suggest to parents who notice our younger students, their younger children who are becoming dysregulated in a way that they see more physical behaviors coming out?
Yeah, I would say a couple things. I think that we need to get them outside more, to be honest with you. There's great research. So if on being outdoors and the mental health impact of being outdoors. So even if it's lousy out, I would say, like, my goal for myself is there's a forest preserve, and my goal is to see that forest preserve every day, no matter what the weather is, because I know that I'm spending a lot more time indoors. I'm not traveling to different schools. I'm not doing a lot of things that I normally do in terms of movement. So I need to be really intentional about that. Kids do need movement. And so what I would say is I would engage them as much as I possibly can in activity myself as a parent, as much as I can. If I need to work, let's make sure that I coordinate my lunches with them, whatever it may be, but spending more time with them. It may be that that's a time when we begin to balance screen time and activity. They may figuring out, is there a good spot for them to be able to do their Zoom classes? Do they need to move around, or is it helpful to have them in a spot? We're all learning. Every kid is going to be a little bit different, but I would make sure that what we're doing is sensitive to the fact that these kids, their bodies need to move. And the more movement breaks we can get, and the more outdoor movement breaks we can get, I think is going to be really, really helpful for kids who are going to be inside a lot more and on screens a lot more than they have before, and social interaction with us as parents or with siblings, so that we can get them interacting in things outside of a screen.
So there's a couple of questions about socialization, right? And talking about communication primarily through FaceTime or email, taking family walks and seeing other people in the neighborhood. right? So then you hear of some families who are comfortable having sleepovers and play dates and traveling, and other families are not. And
Yeah.
how would you help parents navigate those conversations with their children in
Yeah.
terms of like, this is why our family isn't engaging in those things?
Yeah, this is tricky. It's really tricky. And I guess what I would say um, is that this is one of the things that will help kids build resilience, is navigating this disappointment and seeing that um, as hard as it is, that this is something we all have to navigate at some level. Why do they get to have a swimming pool and we don't get to have a swimming pool? There's a lot of ways that kids will compare themselves and feel left out. Why didn't I get invited to the birthday party? All of these things can be hard in and of themselves, but they're also character building if we can help them be. And so for them to be able to understand that different families have different values, and that the values we have are that we believe that they're putting themselves at a risk that we don't feel comfortable with. And I know that that's disappointing for you. And yet in our hearts, this is what our decision is, in order to help make sure that you're safe and we're safe and your grandparents are going to be safe. Um, and and uh, um, and it must be really hard to watch other people, your friends, getting together. But I want to let you know that that this is our decision, and what we want to do is figure out how we can make the most of our time with you. So again, I think there's no easy way of doing this, but being able to share that you understand it's hard. These are our values, and I think these are conversations we have a lot, just not quite um, in this way, in this remarkable time.
You talked about the resiliency that's going to come out of this. What do you think, if any, is going to be a long-term impact on social emotional development of our toddlers, of our younger kids who aren't having that same level of socialization that they might have before this?
Yeah, so I just want to say I don't find myself worried about that. Um, and I think that the reason is um, that kids' brains are remarkably adaptive. And I believe that there are going to be things that they get out of being home more. There are kids that age who go off on around the world sailing trips, and they come back and nobody says, wow, they look at all the social skills they missed. They think, wow, what an amazing experience. And I know this is not an around the world sailing trip, but what I would say is that kids' brains are remarkably malleable. They will adapt and they will continue to grow, and they are growing. And so I believe that by the time, if they're young kids and early elementary and early childhood programming, that you're not going to notice a difference by the time they are in 5th and 6th grade. And they've got a generation, they're going to be growing up together, dealing with the exact same stress. And schools will adapt, and we're going to adapt, and they're going to get there. The brain is an amazing thing. And that's where all these social skills come from, is this brain that's constantly adapting to its conditions. So it's adapting now, and it'll adapt when we're back to not being remote. I don't think that during the Spanish flu, we're not taking a look and saying people who are born like my grandmother, or a little bit later than my grandmother, people aren't saying that there was a real gap in social skills for that group of kids. But we just said we haven't seen it. And so I'm not worried about it happening, especially I think because we've got a greater awareness now than we ever have before about the importance of social emotional development, and we're going to make it happen.
In our community, we do have students who have experienced loss when a parent or relative gets sick from COVID, or just people in their family who are getting sick. And how would you recommend parents to help work with their children through these situations?
I'm not an expert on grief and loss, but what I would say is that different families, I would say opening up the lines of communication as much as we can, being open and honest. This is where we need to tell our stories, and we need to listen to our child's stories about what's hard about this, and they need to hear our stories from a developmentally appropriate way of sharing that how hard this is for us as well, and that we're going to get through this, but that this is a really, really hard time for us. And if you see mommy or daddy in tears, it's because we're missing the person that we lost. And I do think that that's really important, is to be very, very present, and allowing them to share their emotions, to be able to share ours, to let them know it's okay, but that, grief has its own timeline. It's got its own map and compass. We all experience it in a different way, and allowing, taking care of ourselves enough to be present so that we can support our child.
Thank you. So it is almost 8 o'clock. And Dr. Bolton, thank you so much for your time in spending the evening with parents and staff of District 21. I want to read a couple of things that came up in the question and answer.
Sure.
Because I think this probably echoes what other people are thinking.
Sure.
Thank you, Dr. Bolton, for the presentation tonight. The content was very simple, yet deep and applicable. And I think that's definitely what you've been able to provide to our staff both times that you presented in the last 2 years. Another message is, I'm a teacher in another nearby district. Your message was very powerful and applicable. Thank you for the support of teachers and school districts. I would love to have you connect with our district, right?
Sure.
Right, all parents can benefit from this professionalism and wisdom in terms of getting through this. And the last one I'll read before we end for the evening is, I think we need to stop being so hard on ourselves during this time, and that will help us go easier on our children. They need us more than ever for moral and emotional support. I truly believe that all of our kids will catch up academically in time and with time. We all need to recover from this pandemic and remember to give each other a break. So with that, do you have any final words?
No, I love those comments, and if I can be helpful, just reach out by email. I'd love to help in any way I can, and I'm just so grateful for all that, to be a part of what you guys are doing, to be with your staff earlier in the year, and to be with the parent community. I think it's the fact that you are so invested in having everybody learning together as a whole school community. I really admire that. And so thank you so much for this opportunity.
Absolutely. Dr. Connolly?
I just, Doug, I wanted to say thank you again for giving your time this evening. And thank you to all of those who joined us this evening. I think there's really nothing to add. Everything that's been said, I think we're living it every day. And I just really appreciate everybody spending some time with us. And as we get into the holiday season, just be well, take care of each other, and stay safe.
Thanks so much. It's been great to be with all of you.